Have you ever wondered what it's like to walk into a room that changes your life forever? A room so disturbing, so nightmarishly twisted, that even seasoned officers, men and women who have faced the worst humanity has to offer, can barely speak of it without trembling? Imagine stepping into darkness and realizing it's not empty, that it's watching you back. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you this. You found this video for a reason. That lingering curiosity you have? That question in your mind, what did they find in that chamber? Who built it? And why was it hidden in the first place? You're going to get your answers, but only if you stay with me to the very end. I promise, the truth is more chilling, more twisted than you can imagine. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a descent into something far darker, an unraveling of evil that had lived right under everyone's nose. So stay close. Don't look away. What you're about to hear is real. This story begins like many others, with a welfare check. A routine call, the kind local police get every day. Neighbors complain they haven't seen the man who lives in the house for weeks. Mails piling up. Lights never turn on. No signs of movement. At first glance, there's nothing alarming. Just another middle-aged loner keeping to himself in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon, trees lining the street, American flags fluttering on porches, the kind of town where people say hello to strangers and lock their doors at night more out of habit than fear. But behind the worn red door of that house, something ancient and monstrous had been waiting to be discovered. And when those officers stepped inside, they didn't just stumble into a crime scene. They walked into a psychological trap designed to warp the mind, a place that would haunt them long after the case was closed. Now, I want you to take a moment and think. What do you picture when you hear the word chamber? Maybe a small room, sealed off from the rest of the house. Maybe something hidden behind a wall, accessible only if you know where to look. But what these officers found was far more complex, far more deliberate. This wasn't some makeshift room tossed together in panic. No. It was meticulously designed, almost theatrical, as if the person behind it wanted someone to find it, eventually. As if they wanted the horror to be witnessed. This wasn't just a case of criminal behavior. This was psychological warfare. And every inch of that hidden space told a story. A story of control, of obsession, and of pain inflicted in silence. As we move forward in this video, I need you to really listen, not just hear the facts, but feel the weight of what they found. Because this case, it goes beyond the physical evidence. It digs deep into the human mind, into the warped logic of a man who believed he was doing something righteous, even as he built his kingdom of torment one sickening piece at a time. That's the part the headlines never capture. They don't talk about the subtle clues officers saw before they even found the room. The strange smells. The way sounds seemed to vanish the deeper they went into the house. Or the bizarre drawings on the walls, symbols that didn't make sense until they realized what he had been documenting for years. Now let me ask you something. Do you think a person is born with evil inside them? Or is it something they learn, something that grows in the shadows, feeding off isolation and delusion? That's what this case forces us to confront. Because the man behind the chamber, let's call him Arthur for now, wasn't some Hollywood-style villain. He was quiet, polite, educated. A former community college professor who volunteered at the local library. Parents loved him. Kids thought he was that weird but harmless guy down the street. No one suspected he had constructed a fully soundproofed room beneath his basement, hidden behind a false wall, accessible only through a rusted metal hatch covered in old bookshelves. And no one knew what he did inside it, until that one knock at the door changed everything. This story is going to take you places. Places that test the limits of empathy and curiosity. We're going to talk about trauma. About the psychological profile of someone who lives a double life. About the red flags people ignored, and how easy it is for the worst among us to hide in plain sight. We'll walk through the investigation, detail by detail, revealing how forensics, behavioral analysis, and raw human intuition all played a part in cracking open this case. But we'll also go deeper. We'll explore what makes someone like Arthur tick. What drove him to create this chamber. Who his victims were. And why he thought he could get away with it. And by the end of this video, you won't just know what happened. You'll feel like you were there. You'll understand what it means when law enforcement says a scene changes you. I know how easy it is to scroll past videos, to click and never stay long enough to see what's real. But this is real. This isn't some scripted drama. These are lives. These are broken families. And this is justice trying to claw its way through darkness that was never meant to be uncovered. I need you to stay. Not for me, but for the victims whose names you don't yet know, but whose stories deserve to be told with care, with truth, and with clarity. Because if we don't understand the minds of monsters, how can we ever hope to stop the next one? Before I take you down into that basement, before I show you what those officers saw when they finally broke through that wall, I want you to remember this. Not every nightmare comes at night. Some hide in daylight. Some live next door. And when the truth finally comes to light, it's already too late for some. But the question remains, what exactly did they find? What was in that hidden chamber? What was the purpose of the objects they uncovered, each one more terrifying than the last? And who is the real mastermind behind it all? You'll find out. Just don't blink. Arthur Delaney wasn't the type of man who drew attention, which is exactly how he preferred it. He was the neighbor you'd barely notice, always trimming his hedges at the same time every Saturday, always nodding politely but never lingering long enough for small talk. For years, he existed as a background figure in his sleepy Oregon community. But behind that passive exterior was a man who lived by a carefully managed routine, one so rigid and controlled it bordered on obsession. He hadn't held a formal job in nearly 4 years, yet he was never seen struggling financially. His groceries were always delivered. His yard always maintained. His bills always paid. And though he rarely interacted with others, those who did cross his path described him as strange, but harmless. Of course, now that phrase carries an entirely different weight. But at the time, it was enough to keep questions at bay. Arthur was a ghost in his own town, quiet, solitary, and in hindsight, hiding something unimaginable. In the weeks leading up to the welfare call, something shifted. A few neighbors noticed small but unsettling changes. The lights that used to flicker on at exactly 7 p.m. every evening suddenly stayed off for days. The air conditioning unit, which had once buzzed softly through the night, went silent. There were rumors of a strange odor wafting from the backyard, but no one wanted to be the one to investigate too closely. Because Arthur wasn't the only person who had gone quiet. A young woman who occasionally delivered groceries to his home, Jessamine Rowe, hadn't been seen since her last scheduled drop-off. And while her disappearance didn't raise alarms at first, it wouldn't be long before the two cases became impossibly linked. Some said he had gone on vacation. Others joked he'd finally snapped and gone full Unabomber. But underneath the nervous laughter was a growing unease. And yet, as the days dragged on with no sign of Arthur, people began whispering, after all, who wants to accuse a man of something sinister when there's no proof, just a vague feeling in your gut that something isn't right? Investigators began digging into Arthur's recent history, and the more they found, the more unnerved they became. His internet activity was, at first glance, unremarkable. Some purchases from hardware stores, a few survivalist forums, online orders for soundproofing material, industrial-grade locks, and, oddly enough, vintage mannequins. Nothing criminal. Nothing that screamed danger. But when put together, the purchases painted a picture of deliberate construction, something methodical, maybe even ceremonial. As detectives traced his steps, they discovered Arthur had been a regular visitor to online communities centered around conspiracy theories, psychological control, and fringe science. He posted under anonymous usernames, often diving deep into discussions about behavioral modification and sensory deprivation. Again, none of it was illegal, but combined with what officers found in that basement, it became deeply disturbing. But Arthur wasn't the only person of interest. The investigation quickly unearthed a web of connections, any of whom could have played a role in what unfolded. There was Dorian Fields, Arthur's estranged brother, a former military contractor who had reportedly fallen off the grid years earlier after being dishonorably discharged. Dorian had a history of violent outbursts, a documented obsession with mind control experiments, and a cryptic series of handwritten letters addressed to Arthur, which investigators found hidden in a crawl space behind a bookshelf. The letters were bizarre, full of references to the experiment, the vessel, and the transformation. Whether Dorian was involved directly or merely planted seeds in Arthur's mind remains unclear. But the letters added a chilling layer to the unfolding mystery. And then there was Meredith Shaw, Arthur's only known romantic connection, a librarian who had briefly dated him years prior. She described Arthur as deeply intelligent but emotionally vacant. Their relationship ended after only a few months, but she revealed that he had spoken frequently about building something that would outlast death. At the time, she assumed he meant writing a book or crafting some kind of art installation. But now, with the chamber uncovered and the horrors inside exposed, her words took on a sinister weight. Meredith also mentioned a man who used to come by Arthur's house late at night, someone she never identified, but who drove a gray van with no license plates. Security footage from nearby homes confirmed such a vehicle had made multiple visits to Arthur's property over the past year, but its owner has yet to be identified. Was this man an accomplice? A supplier? A witness? Or someone who stumbled into something far worse than he expected? The chamber itself provided more questions than answers. Every corner seemed to whisper a piece of the puzzle, but nothing fit cleanly. There were no bodies, no overt signs of violence. But the atmosphere of the room, the cold, surgical cleanliness of the space, the mounted cameras, the padded restraints, suggested something far more psychological than physical. Detectives described it as a place built not to kill, but to transform. A space meant to erase identity, to reprogram, to strip a person down until they became something else entirely. Who that someone else was meant to be remains one of the most confounding pieces of the investigation. There were artifacts placed like exhibits, items that didn't belong to Arthur. A small hairbrush with initials carved into it. A half-burned journal. Children's shoes. The implications were staggering, and yet without clear evidence of a crime, the case stood on a razor's edge. Red herrings began to flood in. Anonymous tips claimed Arthur was part of a larger cult, that he had been preparing the chamber as a sanctuary for the end times. Others insisted the house had been used by more than one person, that what officers found was only the tip of something much darker hidden in the surrounding woods. One conspiracy theory tied Arthur to the infamous Black Room files, an unsolved case from the early 2000s involving similar chambers found across the country. None of these leads have been confirmed, but each added fuel to a fire that was already spiraling beyond control. Online forums erupted with theories. Some claimed Arthur was innocent, a scapegoat for something bigger. Others were convinced he had been experimenting with psychological torture techniques once used in classified military programs. Each theory pulled viewers deeper, making it harder to separate fact from fiction. And that's exactly where you find yourself now, caught in the web of uncertainty, trying to make sense of a man who made sure his secrets would never be easy to find. You've heard the whispers. You've seen the signs. But the real question is, how far down are you willing to go? Because the closer investigators get to the truth, the more dangerous the story becomes. And somewhere in the shadows of that small Oregon town, something is still waiting to be found. And what happens next? Well, it starts with a knock at the door from someone no one ever expected to see again. Let me know when you're ready for the next part. We're just getting started. Just when detectives thought they were beginning to form a clear picture of what Arthur Delaney had been hiding, the case took a sudden and baffling turn. Less than 48 hours after the chamber had been discovered, one of the most critical pieces of evidence, a set of digital files pulled from Arthur's encrypted hard drive, vanished from the police evidence locker. The files had only been partially decrypted, but what little had been extracted hinted at a disturbing series of recordings, surveillance logs, journal entries, even what appeared to be transcripts of one-sided conversations. According to the lead technician who first reviewed them, the voice on the files didn't match Arthur's. That alone was enough to raise flags. But now, with the data wiped and no backup copy left behind, investigators found themselves at a dangerous crossroads. Either they had a tech leak inside the department, or someone else was still out there watching, listening, and making sure the truth never surfaced. Tension inside the department began to rise as suspicions turned inward. The team assigned to the Delaney case was abruptly reshuffled. 2 officers were reassigned without warning. Another, Officer Rhonda Keene, one of the first to enter the basement, filed for immediate leave citing unforeseen personal trauma, though her partner claimed she'd started receiving anonymous messages warning her to let it go. These weren't ordinary threats. They included information that hadn't been released to the public, details about Rhonda's family, her children's names, her home address. It was a clear message: stop digging. But for the officers still determined to uncover the truth. And then there was her past. Miles ran a quiet background check and discovered Vanessa had once interned at the very research firm funding Arthur's mysterious transfers. She had never mentioned it. When confronted, she brushed it off, claiming it was a minor academic connection, and insisted she had left before anything unethical occurred. But Miles couldn't shake the feeling that her presence wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Miles wasn't alone in chasing answers. Enter Vanessa Morley, a civilian crime analyst with a background in neuropsychology who had volunteered to assist after hearing about the chamber. She brought with her a new set of tools: behavioral pattern mapping, digital footprint analysis, and access to dark web forums where Arthur's name was beginning to circulate like a ghost story. At first, Miles appreciated the help. Vanessa was sharp, thorough, and seemed genuinely invested. But as time passed, something about her didn't sit right. She was too eager, too informed. She seemed to know things before she should, details that hadn't left the briefing room, a system of players, each operating in the background under layers of false identities. It wasn't until he started pulling Arthur's financial records that he found something strange: a monthly wire transfer from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, going back nearly 6 years. The money wasn't much, around $3,000 each month, but it was consistent, and it didn't trace back to Arthur's name. Instead, it was linked to a now-defunct psychological research firm that had once conducted controversial experiments under a government contract. The firm had gone dark years ago following a whistleblower scandal, and many believed its records had been destroyed. But now, that same name was tied to Arthur Delaney. Was he a former subject? A researcher? Or just a pawn in something much larger? At the center of this growing storm stood Detective Miles Rennick, a seasoned but quietly obsessive investigator who had followed the Delaney case since the beginning. Miles wasn't new to bizarre crimes or shadowy figures, but something about this case had burrowed deep under his skin. His instincts told him they were dealing with more than one person, perhaps a network, who had that level of access. And more importantly, why go through such lengths to silence the investigation? The warnings only deepened the mystery. The deeper they went, the more fragmented the narrative became. A hidden betrayal began to surface, one dating back to Arthur's college years. Records revealed he had once been part of a small experimental group studying cognitive influence and sensory manipulation. The group was disbanded after one participant suffered a complete psychological break and disappeared under suspicious circumstances. No charges were filed. No press was ever involved. But the group's lead researcher? He later changed his name and was now living under a new identity, just one town over. When approached, the man refused to speak, claiming he didn't want to go missing too. His warning was vague but chilling. And what he said next chilled Miles to the core. Arthur was never the real danger. He was the doorway. The phrase echoed like a riddle, heavy with implications. What did it mean to be the doorway? A conduit? A puppet? A target? As Miles and his team tried to make sense of it, more loose ends started to emerge. Reports of missing persons from nearby towns, dating back years, many with eerily similar profiles, young, socially isolated, with ties to experimental research programs. Most were written off as runaways. But suddenly, they looked more like footprints leading to a single terrifying destination. And then came the phone call. It wasn't traced. It lasted less than 30 seconds. A heavily distorted voice simply said, "You're looking in the wrong direction. The real subject is still inside." Before Miles could respond, the call ended. No location. No caller ID. Just a cryptic message that threw everything they thought they knew into question. Inside where? The house? The chamber? Or somewhere else entirely? That's when the second chamber was discovered, sealed beneath a different property, 3 counties away, and registered to a name no one had ever heard before. And that's where we'll pick up next. Because whatever you think you know about Arthur Delaney, trust me, the real story hasn't even begun yet. You said. Just days after the second chamber was discovered, this one buried beneath an abandoned farmhouse in rural Indiana and concealed with surgical precision, another unexpected development threw the investigation into chaos. A woman named Lila Mercer, a name that had never once appeared in the Delaney files, walked into the precinct and requested to speak privately with Detective Miles Rennick. At first, her presence didn't spark any alarms. She introduced herself as a former therapist, someone who had worked quietly in the outskirts of the state, offering grief counseling for those suffering from complex trauma. But when she handed Miles a faded intake form with Arthur Delaney's signature printed neatly at the bottom, everything changed. Lila claimed Arthur had come to her under an alias nearly a decade ago, paranoid, anxious, and haunted by what he called memories that weren't his. She said he often spoke in fragments, describing a room without doors, voices without faces, and an overwhelming sense that he was part of something he had no memory of joining. Her clinical notes painted a man on the verge of collapse, but also hinted at something else. Something darker. Lila hadn't come forward earlier out of fear, she said, and not just for her safety. Years ago, shortly after Arthur stopped showing up to sessions, Lila began receiving cryptic letters, handwritten, always unsigned. Each letter included references to things only Arthur would have known. But they also included chilling predictions, accidents that later came true, names of people who would later go missing, and an eerie warning that she would be watched for as long as she remembered him. For years, she remained silent, keeping the letters locked in a safety deposit box. But when she saw Arthur's name trending again in connection to the chamber discovery, something inside her cracked. She knew it wasn't over. She knew it never had been. What Lila didn't know, and what Miles quickly realized, was that the second chamber's location had a disturbing connection to her own past. The farmhouse once belonged to her grandfather, a reclusive man who died decades ago and was rumored in town to have been involved in Cold War psychological research. She had never set foot in the house since childhood, and according to county records, it had changed hands multiple times under shell corporations. When forensic teams began analyzing the site, they found it had been renovated within the last 5 years. New wiring, high-tech surveillance equipment, and a series of hidden rooms insulated from thermal imaging. Whatever had happened there wasn't ancient history. It was recent, active, possibly still ongoing. Then came another twist. A key piece of evidence recovered from the second chamber, a locked metal case, was finally opened. Inside, instead of the expected files or tools, investigators found a stack of photographs. Dozens of them, each one showing different people standing outside the first Delaney property. Most of the faces were unfamiliar. Some were blurred or half-obscured, but one image stood out. A clear, time-stamped photo of Detective Miles Rennick standing in front of the house 2 days before the initial welfare call had been made. Miles was stunned. He had no memory of being there before the call. No reports, no assignments, nothing in his logs. The timestamp didn't lie. And worse, his clothing in the photo matched what he had worn that day, down to the frayed collar on his shirt. It was like someone had orchestrated the entire investigation around him, placing him where he needed to be, without his knowledge. The implications were staggering. Was someone manipulating time-stamped evidence? Or, more terrifyingly, manipulating memory? Vanessa Morley, still working closely on the case, offered a chilling hypothesis. She referenced a classified experiment she had read about in a leaked database, one that tested long-term memory implantation using subliminal audio triggers. If Arthur had been part of such a program, it was possible others involved were also unknowingly compromised. Miles didn't want to believe it, but his mind had begun to betray him. He'd been losing time, waking up disoriented, and experiencing strange déjà vu during interviews and crime scene walkthroughs. He chalked it up to stress, to the gravity of the case, but now, that explanation no longer held weight. If he couldn't trust his own memory, how could he trust his instincts? How could he trust anyone? Meanwhile, Lila Mercer began receiving new messages. This time, they were digital emails from throwaway accounts, each one containing a single sentence. The first said, "You were warned not to speak." The second, "You brought them back." The third email arrived with a video attachment, no subject line, no text. The footage appeared to be from a body cam, panning across a dimly lit hallway filled with framed photographs. As the camera turned, it paused in front of one frame, an image of Lila as a child, standing outside the very farmhouse where the second chamber had been found. The camera slowly zoomed in, and then cut to black. The questions began multiplying faster than the answers. Who took the photo of Miles? Who had access to Arthur's memories? Or worse, control over them? Was Lila an unwitting participant or something more? And if the chambers were still being maintained, then by who? Every lead seemed to bring them closer to something massive, something carefully hidden under layers of psychological manipulation, misinformation, and fear. A chilling possibility emerged. What if Arthur wasn't the architect of these horrors, but just another subject in a long line of carefully curated experiments? And just when the pieces seemed like they might begin to fit together, a third chamber was discovered, this time across state lines. And inside, a single, freshly written message carved into the wall. It read, "He's not the only one they opened." Miles Rennick hadn't slept in over 36 hours. His mind, once sharp and calculating, had started to unravel beneath the relentless weight of doubt. At first, it was just a feeling, a nagging sensation in the pit of his stomach, like he was being watched. But soon, that quiet unease turned into something more sinister. He began noticing small changes around his apartment. Drawers left open when he was sure he'd closed them, the faint scent of cologne that wasn't his, and his laptop's browser history cleared despite him never deleting a thing. Then came the moment he couldn't explain away. At 2:47 a.m., his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It was a snapshot of him asleep in his bed, taken from the hallway just outside his bedroom door. His heart stopped. He didn't hear anyone enter. The door had been locked. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. The photo was a brutal turning point. Until then, this case had felt like a haunting puzzle, one that demanded obsession and sacrifice. But now it wasn't just a case. It was personal. It was invasive. It was a warning. And that sense of control he had clung to like a life raft was suddenly gone. The message was clear. They could get to him any time they wanted. He wasn't chasing the mystery anymore.
He was caught inside it.
He tried to tell himself it was intimidation, just a scare tactic to make him back off, but deep down he knew better. Whoever had sent that photo had been close enough to touch him. Close enough to kill him, if they wanted to. And they didn't. That meant something. They wanted him to keep going, but only on their terms. The next morning brought more chaos. Vanessa Morley, his trusted partner in the investigation, didn't show up to the scheduled debriefing. No call. No text. Nothing. Her last known location pinged off a cell tower near a remote park on the outskirts of town, but after that, her phone went dark. Miles drove out there himself, heart pounding, dread clawing at his throat. He scoured the area with local deputies, calling her name into the dense woods, but there was no sign of her. Not even a footprint. Only her car was found, parked near a hiking trailhead, unlocked with her ID and badge sitting neatly on the passenger seat. It felt staged, almost too clean. And Miles couldn't shake the chilling possibility that this was all meant for him. To shake him, to isolate him, to warn him that no one was untouchable. With Vanessa gone and trust in short supply, Miles began spiraling. He re-examined everything, his notes, the crime scene photos, even the autopsy reports, trying to find some kind of logic, some overlooked detail that might shift the odds back in his favor. That's when he stumbled across something buried in Arthur Delaney's psychiatric file, something he hadn't noticed before. A name scribbled in the margin, nearly illegible, Lorne Acker. A quick search revealed that Acker was a former military psychologist who had disappeared from public records over 15 years ago. No obituary, no retirement, just vanished. But deep in an old web archive, Miles found a photograph from a long-shuttered conference on cognitive warfare, Acker standing in front of a presentation titled Implanted Trauma as Behavioral Control, Ethical Boundaries in Neural Rewiring. In the background of the image, seated in the audience, was a young man who looked eerily like Arthur Delaney. The timestamp placed the photo years before Arthur's supposed mental breakdown. Miles felt the room shift around him. The implications were staggering. If Acker had been experimenting with psychological manipulation at this level, and Arthur was one of his subjects, then everything, the chambers, the strange behavior, the memory loss, might not just be a side effect. It could have been the goal. But what if Arthur hadn't been the only subject? What if there were more? And what if Miles himself had unknowingly been pulled into this experiment, not as an investigator, but as a variable? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something sharp sliding across his floor. He turned slowly, blood draining from his face. A small envelope had been slipped under his door. No name, no return address. Just a blank white envelope with the words, "You're next," scrawled in thick black ink across the front. Inside, there was another photograph. This one showed Vanessa, bound and blindfolded, seated in what looked like an old industrial basement. The background was dim, but a familiar object sat on the wall behind her, a rusted, circular mirror identical to the ones recovered from both hidden chambers. The image was grainy, time-stamped just an hour earlier. She was still alive. Miles dropped the envelope and staggered back. Panic surged through him, crashing over whatever was left of his rational mind. He had no idea who to trust. No idea how deep this conspiracy ran, and no clue how to stop something he barely understood. He wanted to believe there was still time, that he could save Vanessa, that he could make sense of this nightmare. But every time he pulled a thread, the fabric of the mystery only seemed to grow tighter around his neck. Then came the final blow of the day. A letter arrived from the county records office. He hadn't requested anything recently, but the package was addressed to him directly. Inside were property blueprints for a third Delaney location, one he didn't even know existed. It had been filed under a different name, long since sold and rebuilt. But tucked in the back of the packet, barely visible, was a faded note signed by someone using the initials LA. The note read, "They're not dead, Miles. Just repurposed. That's the real horror." And just like that, Miles realized this wasn't a story of one man's descent into madness. It was a system, an operation, one that had been running for decades. And now, it was his turn to play his part. But the worst part? He still didn't know who was pulling the strings. Or why he was chosen. Miles didn't sleep that night. The photo of Vanessa, the cryptic message, the envelope, the blueprints, all of it had wrapped around him like a vice, squeezing tighter with each unanswered question. But when the morning came, something unexpected shifted. A call came through from a blocked number. He answered without hesitation, expecting another threat or maybe even Vanessa's voice under duress. But instead, a calm, unfamiliar voice spoke, slow and measured. "You've been chasing the wrong man, Miles." Arthur Delaney was never the architect. He was the first victim. Then the line went dead. Miles stood frozen, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Everything he'd built, every assumption, every sleepless night connecting Delaney to the Chamber of Horrors, suddenly cracked apart. With new doubt gnawing at him, he returned to his notes, digging deeper into the old police reports, therapist records, and forgotten digital trails. And buried in a forgotten stack of background checks on Delaney's old colleagues, he found one name that made his blood run cold: Detective Caleb Vaughn. Vaughn wasn't just some retired cop who had worked Arthur's case in the beginning. He had signed off on the psychiatric hold. He had overseen the initial search that never reported a second chamber beneath the house. And stranger still, Miles discovered something he had somehow missed over and over. Vaughn was the man who introduced Arthur to a psychiatrist. The same psychiatrist who conveniently passed away in a boating accident just 2 weeks before Arthur's arrest. A gnawing sense of betrayal gripped Miles as he realized he had spoken to Vaughn just weeks ago for insight. Vaughn had acted helpful, even sympathetic, like he cared. But in hindsight, everything he said had been vague, sidestepping anything specific about Arthur's time before his breakdown. What if Vaughn hadn't just covered something up? What if he had orchestrated it? Pushed Arthur over the edge, then buried the evidence deep enough to make sure no one ever questioned the official narrative? Determined to confront him, Miles drove to Vaughn's last known address, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, off-grid, barely marked. The place was quiet, too quiet. No car in the driveway, no lights. The wind was sharp and biting as Miles stepped out and made his way to the porch. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and something far worse, a rotten, metallic scent that sent alarm bells through his nervous system. The living room was sparsely furnished, but along the far wall stood a corkboard nearly 6 feet wide, covered in photos, timelines, handwritten notes. Miles moved closer and realized what he was looking at. It wasn't Arthur's timeline. It was his. Every move Miles had made in the last 3 months was documented. Dates, locations, even screenshots of emails he hadn't shared with anyone. There were surveillance photos of him at his office, at the grocery store, even inside his own building. A manila envelope sat taped to the center of the board, labeled Subject 47, Miles Rennick. His hands shook as he opened it, pulling out pages of what appeared to be observation logs. But the final page made his knees buckle. It was a psychological profile of him. And at the bottom, written in the same handwriting from the note found in the blueprint packet, were the words, "Receptive to conditioning. Phase 2 begins upon breach." It wasn't just about Arthur anymore. Miles had been the target from the start, not by chance, not because he stumbled into the investigation, but because he had been placed into it. His obsession with the case hadn't been his own. It had been fed, curated from the shadows. A puppet string here, a breadcrumb there. They'd led him to believe he was the hunter. But in truth, he'd been on display, studied, pushed. Arthur wasn't the broken one. He was the warning. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Miles saw it, an old VHS tape sitting beside a dusty television. Curiosity overpowered caution as he slid it into the deck and hit play. Static filled the screen, followed by a flickering image. It was a camera feed, grainy but clear enough to make out 2 figures in a dark room. One was Vanessa, gagged and blindfolded. The other was him. Not a lookalike. Not a deepfake. Him. Calm. Emotionless. Standing behind her with a hand on her shoulder. He staggered back, ball rising in his throat. What was he watching? Was it real? Had he been drugged, manipulated, controlled? Or was this another layer of deception meant to break him? Everything he believed in, every memory, every decision, suddenly felt contaminated, like a dream he couldn't trust. If he couldn't be sure of his own actions, how could he possibly know who the enemy was? And then came the final blow, as the screen cut to black and one final line of text faded in, letter by letter. You were never investigating the chamber, Miles. You were created by it. The truth didn't just change the story, it rewrote it entirely. And now, the real horror was just beginning. You said. Miles sat in his car for what felt like hours, his mind a chaotic blur of thoughts that wouldn't settle. The image of himself on the VHS tape was seared into his memory, an unshakable phantom that made him question not only his actions, but his own identity. He couldn't deny it, it was him. The posture, the expression, even the scar above his left eyebrow. And Vanessa, tied, helpless, and unaware, was a constant reminder that whatever was happening wasn't just about conspiracy or hidden chambers anymore. It was personal. It was psychological. And it was far from over. The next move came not from instinct, but from the place inside him that still needed answers. He had to talk to someone he could trust. Or, at least someone he used to trust. His sister. Marissa had always been the grounding voice in his life. The calm, rational therapist who once helped soldiers with PTSD rebuild their lives. If there was anyone who could walk him through this mental labyrinth, it was her. But as he sat in her living room, trying to explain what he'd found, what he'd seen. He noticed something strange in her eyes. Not fear, not disbelief, but hesitation, as if she already knew. And that was when she said it, so quietly it nearly slipped past him. They came to me years ago. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd make you disappear. The air was sucked from the room. Miles stared at her, mouth half open, brain still buffering the confession. She didn't cry. She didn't break. Her voice stayed steady as she explained how they, whoever they were, approached her just after his psychiatric internship ended. How they warned her to keep him in check. How they sent her updates, reports about his behavior, his mental health, his triggers. And worst of all, how she agreed to it all just to protect him. His blood turned cold. The betrayal wasn't violent, but it gutted him. His own sister, his confidant, had been part of it. Maybe not the experiment itself, but the monitoring, the manipulation. And when he asked her what exactly she meant by cooperate, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a sleek black device, part USB, part something far more advanced. This was supposed to be plugged into your laptop, she whispered, to monitor your sleep patterns and behavior. But I never did it. I kept it hidden. That moment became a crossroads. Everything inside Miles screamed for him to walk away, to run from the nightmare that had consumed his life. But then came her plea, soft, guilt-ridden, and trembling. They'll come for me if they know I told you this. But if you want to end this, really end this, you have to go back to where it started. She handed him a worn folder marked Patient Zero, July 1996. Inside were faded documents, surveillance photos, and a single address scrawled in red pen. It wasn't a name or place he recognized, but it was enough to know this went back decades. Far longer than he'd ever imagined. Before he could even decide his next move, the lights in her house flickered once, then again, before going dark. His heart pounded as he grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her into the hallway. A low humming filled the air, not from the house but outside. A vehicle, black, unmarked, and idling by the curb with its headlights off. He had no choice but to flee. But not before she stopped him, tears brimming now as she whispered, "If they take me, don't come after me. Just finish it." Now he was alone again. But not just alone, cornered. Everything was spiraling faster, tighter. And then the ultimatum came. A message on his burner phone, one he hadn't used in weeks. "You have until midnight to turn over the folder. If you don't, we'll release the full footage of you with Vanessa. Choose wisely, your truth or her life." It was a trap. He knew that. But it was also a test. A game of psychological warfare played by people who knew him better than he knew himself. Every move was anticipated. Every reaction was predicted. And the folder, whatever it contained, was more dangerous than anything he'd uncovered so far. But the thought of Vanessa, trapped, silenced, maybe hurt because of his actions, twisted his gut in a way no threat ever had. His options were clear. If he turned over the file, he might buy her more time but lose his only leverage. If he kept it and pushed forward, he might expose the truth, but risk destroying the one person he still cared about. It wasn't a riddle with a clever answer. It was a wound with no bandage. As the night deepened and the time ticked down toward midnight, Miles found himself in the middle of a storm that was no longer just about right or wrong. It was about survival, identity, legacy. He had one final chance to decide who he was, just another puppet tangled in someone else's strings, or the one who would finally burn it all down. But even now, as he prepared to make that choice, he couldn't shake one last thought. If they had known him this intimately all along, was he really the one making the choice? And in the silence that followed, something in the corner of the room began to blink red. Watching, waiting, recording. The rain had started again, sharp, cold, and relentless, like the night was trying to scrub away the truth Miles was about to uncover. He gripped the folder tighter as he raced through the parking garage of an abandoned office building downtown, heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The place wasn't on any city grid anymore, listed under a fake LLC that hadn't paid taxes in a decade. But the address had been circled 3 times in the file Marissa gave him, underlined with the word origin in red ink. If this was the beginning, he was ready for the end. Inside, the building was silent. Too silent. Each step echoed with eerie precision, bouncing back at him like accusations. On the third floor, tucked behind a panel of rusted filing cabinets, he found a hidden service elevator with a keypad smeared with dust. He typed in the birth date from the top of the folder, July 16th, 1996. The doors groaned open. He stepped in. As the elevator descended past levels that didn't exist on any blueprint, he realized this wasn't just about him, or even Vanessa. This was a machine engineered and operated by people who had embedded themselves in his life like parasites, feeding, studying, predicting. The doors opened into a room lit only by the blue flicker of monitors. Dozens of screens lined the walls, each one cycling through camera feeds of different locations, parks, homes, schools. Faces he recognized. Not just Vanessa. Not just Marissa.
But people from his past.
Neighbors. Teachers. Friends long thought lost to time. All being watched. All connected. It wasn't just a surveillance operation, it was a control system. And someone was orchestrating it all. Then he saw him. Dr. Bennett. The mentor who helped him through med school. The man who used to buy him coffee and talk about healing minds, not controlling them. He stood in the center of the room, clipboard in hand, looking older, colder, but utterly unsurprised to see Miles. "I was wondering when you'd find us," he said, like it was all part of the plan. "I always said you were the most promising subject." The words stung like acid.
Subject.
Not student. Not mentee. Subject. And just like that, the mask came off. Bennett wasn't just part of this, he was running it. He explained everything in that flat, emotionless tone he used to use in lectures. The program had started as a government-funded behavioral study, legal, documented, ethical on paper. But when the funding dried up, the real work had only just begun. Volunteers turned into test cases. Test cases turned into assets. And then people like Miles were introduced, smart, broken, malleable. "We created the trauma," Bennett said. "Then we studied your response to it. The betrayal was too big to process." Miles reeled as Bennett pointed to a monitor showing his childhood home. "You think your father's accident was just bad luck?" he said. "You think your spiral into psychiatry was your idea?" Everything, Miles. Everything was nudged. But that wasn't the worst of it. From the shadows, another figure stepped forward. Agent Keller. The federal investigator who had reached out months ago, claiming to be looking into missing persons tied to an underground syndicate. She'd acted like an ally, digging with him, warning him. Now she held a gun. Not at Bennett. At Miles. "You were never supposed to go this far," she said, her voice now void of warmth. "We needed to contain you, not lose you in the maze." His hands went up instinctively, but his mind was spinning faster than his fear. Keller wasn't just complicit, she was enforcement. The muscle that kept the program under wraps. Every time she told him to be careful, every time she leaked information, it was all manipulation. Psychological conditioning dressed up as guidance. The final blow came when she tossed a file at his feet. Inside were pictures of himself with Vanessa, every encounter, every conversation. Staged. Coordinated. Managed. "She was brought in to stabilize you," Keller said. "But then she got too close. And you started asking questions we couldn't control." Suddenly, the thread on his phone made horrifying sense. Vanessa wasn't just a victim. She was collateral. The entire conspiracy was more than an experiment. It was a system, fine-tuned to create and destroy human lives for the sake of control. Behavior modification. Psychological obedience. And now Miles stood in the center of it, betrayed by every guiding figure in his life, forced to choose between submission and obliteration. Bennett stepped closer, his voice a whisper now. "You want out? Burn the file. Walk away. And this all disappears. No one has to know." But as he looked around the room, at the screens and the lives caught in their web, he realized walking away wouldn't save him. It would only doom others. People like Vanessa. Like Marissa. Like the kids on those screens who still had time to escape the system. He took a breath, his mind locked on one thought. If this ends with me, then let it end loud. And just as Keller raised her gun again, something inside the system began to glitch. Screens flickered. Alarms blared. Somewhere above ground, someone had just triggered an override. Someone else was watching, and they didn't want the truth buried. But who? And why now? The floor beneath him rumbled. The lights went red. And everything he thought he knew was about to be rewritten again. The walls were trembling, not from an explosion or machinery, but from something deeper, something unraveling at the core. Miles could feel it in his bones, in the stale, recycled air now thick with electricity and dread. Sirens screamed from somewhere overhead, red strobes flickering like dying stars across the surveillance screens, now glitching one by one, as if a digital exorcism was underway. The room had shifted from a cold control center to a battlefield where reality itself felt unstable. And standing in the center of it all, Miles faced Bennett, Keller, an invisible weight of years of deception finally collapsing in on itself. "You think chaos is going to free you?" Bennett shouted over the noise, his facade beginning to crack. His voice, once calm and calculating, now trembled with something Miles had never seen in him before: fear. "You have no idea what's at stake. This goes far beyond you. Far beyond me." Miles didn't flinch. "You made it about me the moment you wired my life to this place." A sudden flash across the monitor caught his eye: Vanessa. She was alive, bound and terrified, locked in what looked like another part of the compound. But the feed was unstable. The clock on the screen was ticking down. Some kind of countdown. A failsafe. Keller lunged to stop him as he darted toward the control panel, but Miles grabbed the fire extinguisher beside the console and slammed it into the base of her knee. She screamed, collapsing to the floor, her gun clattering and spinning into the dark. Bennett made a break for the exit, but Miles was faster this time. He caught the older man by the collar and shoved him against the server stack, sparks flying as circuits shorted behind them. "Where is she?" Miles demanded. But Bennett just laughed, a bitter, unhinged sound. "You still don't get it, do you? She's part of it too. She was created for you." Miles froze. "You're lying." Bennett's grin widened. "She's not who you think she is. The perfect match. The supportive partner. She was our control variable. You didn't fall in love. You were programmed to." That moment almost broke him. He staggered back, the weight of it too much, the idea that even the most human connection in his life had been engineered. But then something in him snapped, not from pain, but clarity. Maybe Vanessa had been planted. Maybe it had all been designed. But if she was still alive, and if there was even a chance that some part of it had been real, then none of that mattered. He had to get to her. He scanned the system for access, hands moving instinctively through the hacked interface, triggering door overrides and disabling the building's internal lockdown. The compound began shaking harder now, more power surges, more systems crashing. Outside help, whoever they were, had made it past the firewalls. Backup was on its way. But that wasn't the twist. The twist came when he finally found the sublevel where Vanessa was kept. The camera feed sharpened. She looked up and said his name before the audio cut out. And that's when he saw it. Her hands weren't bound. There were no guards. And the countdown wasn't to her destruction. It was to her release. Miles turned slowly, the pieces snapping into place in the cruelest, most twisted way. Keller wasn't the final threat. Bennett wasn't the mastermind. Vanessa was. Behind him, the elevator doors opened once more, but this time there was no alarm, no warning. Only silence. And then her voice. "You did everything just like we hoped," she said, stepping into the chaos, calm as ever. "You found the chamber. You discovered the files. You unraveled the whole story because we needed you to. They would have never let me destroy this place. But you are the perfect Trojan horse." He stared at her in disbelief as she moved past him, toward the central console, entering a final string of commands. The lights flickered, the screens died, and the countdown hit 0. "This place will be dust in 2 minutes, she said. "No more tests. No more surveillance. And no more ties." "Why?" he managed to whisper. Why pretend? She finally looked him in the eye, and her expression shifted, just for a second, from clinical detachment to something almost human. Because you are the only one who ever made me question the mission. And with that, she kissed his cheek, then vanished into the smoke and sparks as the compound began to collapse around him. Miles had a choice: chase her or escape. But either way, he now understood the truth. The real experiment wasn't how far someone could be pushed, it was what they'd become when they finally pushed back.
You said.
When the dust finally settled and the sirens stopped wailing, the compound was nothing more than scorched earth and mangled steel, an eerie silence replacing the chaos that had once echoed through its hidden corridors. Miles stood at the edge of the wreckage, bruised, burned, but alive, his eyes scanning the horizon as emergency crews worked in the background, unaware of the full scope of what had really gone down inside. The world above carried on, oblivious to how close it had come to something far darker than they could imagine. Reporters would call it an isolated fire at a defunct research facility. Officials would bury it beneath redacted reports and classified statements. But Miles knew it had truly existed there. He had lived it. And now, as much as he wanted answers, closure, justice, he realized that what he really needed was peace. In the weeks that followed, Miles returned to the only place that felt untouched by the madness, his late father's cabin, tucked deep in the woods of Vermont. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that echoed with the ghosts of conversations long past. He spent hours just staring out over the lake, trying to make sense of the things he'd seen, the people he'd trusted, and the web of lies that had defined the last year of his life. Keller's silence in custody spoke volumes. She hadn't betrayed him out of malice, but duty. She believed in the mission until the mission turned on her. And Bennett, well, he'd disappeared in the final chaos. His body never recovered, his legacy likely rewritten by whatever agency cleaned up the mess. But Vanessa's fate haunted him most of all.
No body.
No trace. No confirmation that she'd perished in the collapse. Some nights he dreamed she walked into the cabin, same calm demeanor, same haunting intelligence, offering him a cigarette and asking, "Did it work?" Other nights, he was the one asking, begging her for the truth, about the program, about their relationship, about what parts of it were ever real. He never got an answer, not even in dreams. Still, fragments of the truth began to surface in coded leaks and anonymous documents across dark corners of the internet. Whispers of an experimental AI behavioral program, of subjects unaware they were test cases, of ethical boundaries shattered in the name of national interest. None of it made the news, but those who knew how to look found the trail. Some called Miles a whistleblower, others a pawn. The conspiracy theorists had a field day, but even they didn't get it all right. They didn't know the whole story. Maybe no one ever would. And in a strange way, Miles was okay with that. Because the final piece came to him not through data or confrontation, but in a dusty envelope found among his father's old belongings. Inside was a photograph of his father, young, standing in front of a military facility that looked eerily like the compound he'd just destroyed. On the back, in fading ink, were 4 words: "They always come back." Suddenly it all connected. This wasn't new. This wasn't just about him. It was a cycle, generations deep. And somehow, without knowing it, he'd been born into the middle of it. He burned the photo that night, not out of fear, but to sever the tie. If they came back, they'd find no trail, no witness, no surviving files. Just a man rebuilding a quiet life, in a cabin no one cared about, surrounded by silence and guarded by the truth he chose to carry alone. And maybe that was enough. Not justice, not revenge, not total understanding, but peace, the kind that comes from choosing what to remember and what to let go. Still, on certain nights, when the moon was just right and the wind moved through the trees like whispers, he swore he could hear her voice.
Calm. Sharp.
Unmistakable. Asking one last question that would never stop echoing in his mind. What if this was just the beginning? And with that thought lingering like smoke in the air, the screen would fade to black, leaving every viewer wondering the same thing: how much of what we live is truly ours and how much is being watched, shaped, and controlled without us even realizing it.